Okay, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. So yesterday we pretty much, I would say, focused on these two ayat. وَهُمْ يَنْهَوْنَ عَنْهُ وَيَنْأَوْنَ عَنْهُ. Well, actually, the day before it was وَهُمْ يَنْهَوْنَ عَنْهُ وَيَنْأَوْنَ عَنْهُ, with the story of Abu Talib, the story of Abdullah ibn Zibara, and yesterday we were doing a little bit of overview with this one. And وَلَوْ تَرَى إِذْ وُقِفُوا عَلَى النَّارِ فَقَالُوا يَا لَيْتَنَا نُرَدُّ وَلَا نُكَذِّبَ بِآيَاتِ رَبِّنَا. And we said there are two different قراءات for وَلَا نُكَذِّبَ or وَلَا نُكَذِّبُ بِآيَاتِ رَبِّنَا وَنَكُونُ and وَنَكُونَ مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. So وَلَا نُكَذِّبُ بِآيَاتِ رَبِّنَا وَنَكُونُ مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ, or is it وَلَا نُكَذِّبَ بِآيَاتِ رَبِّنَا وَنَكُونَ مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. So we talked about those two قراءات a little bit, and we also talked about بَلْ بَدَا لَهُم مَّا كَانُوا يُخْفُونَ مِن قَبْلُ وَلَوْ رُدُّوا لَعَادُوا لِمَا نُهُوا عَنْهُ وَإِنَّهُمْ لَكَاذِبُونَ. And we also talked about بَلْ بَدَا لَهُم مَّا كَانُوا يُخْفُونَ مِن قَبْلُ. We talked about مَا كَانُوا يُخْفُونَ مِن قَبْلُ, what they were hiding before. Was it that they were hiding the truth, or was it that they were hiding was it that they were hiding their disbelief, if we're talking about the munafiqeen, or was it that they were hiding their fear in order to, of course, not give more spaces for more acceptance for the Muslims and for the Prophet ﷺ, so they would hide it away from the weaker ones. Okay, so we talked about this ayah, and we said the different context was actually bringing in the different interpretations of how to understand this ayah right there. وَلَوْ رُدُّوا لَعَادُوا لِمَا نُهُوا عَنْهُ. If they were to come back to it, they would actually go back to the behavior that they were engaged in. And we went in details with certain things about are we actually forced to be in what we're in right now? So we went in some details in that regards, and we talked about, okay, well, what does it mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created certain people that were basically going to be created for hellfire? So we went with this page, and we went in talking about in takfuru fa inna Allah ghaniyun ankum. And to summarize, we said that there are two things: is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created certain laws in the world that if a person were to choose, that they would basically be choosing the path of basically hellfire, because they had chosen those behaviors, they had chosen those ideas, or because if you're choosing an idea, that means you're choosing to walk at a certain path. That's basically the whole idea. If you choose a certain idea, that means you're taking the implication to guide you towards a certain way. So we were talking about that piece of it, and we were also talking about free will. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us free will, but then at the same time, this free will is to be given to us, or it was given to us in order to be tested. But with the testing comes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had giving us two different things, which is, one, we recognize that there is shukr, or there is Islam, and we recognize that there's kufr. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Inna hadaynahu sabil. So we were created with certain instincts on the inside, certain let's call it compass, that we would be capable of finding the truth if we were to work towards finding the truth, whether in action or whether in vision. Okay, in other words, aqidah and amanu wa amilu salihat. And certainly, hadaynahu najdain, there are two different polars that if you were to invest in getting better, that was going to take you closer to basically good. And if you were to engage in wrongdoings, that was going to take you closer to basically the pole of evil. Okay, so we talked about those areas and made it clear to understand that no, you were not created to basically get into hellfire, or that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with this hadith, when Sayyidah Aisha was told, when she was told by the Prophet ﷺ, do you know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created hellfire, created Jannah, and created some people to go in here, some people to go in there? And we said that that's a wrong interpretation, but it's that there are certain people that are going to dwell in hellfire, others are going to dwell in Jannah. But what determines is basically the person choosing what path they would want to follow, and what ideas they would embrace, and what principles they would basically live based on. And that's everybody basically having the ability to follow what is right and what is wrong. And it's, of course, an investment, and an investment that one and each one would have to work on in order to get closer to Jannah. Okay, so this and all of that prelude was in order to explain وَلَوْ رُدُّوا لَعَادُوا لِمَا نُهُوا عَنْهُ. If they were to be brought back, in other words, brought back to life, they would go back to the same behavior, to the same choices. وَإِنَّهُمْ لَكَاذِبُونَ. And they were just lying. So why would they go back to the same choices? They would go back to the same choices because of the susceptibility that they had built within themselves. This is important. They would go back to living this life, even though they regret, and they had seen that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was holding them accountable when they were saying that if they were to go back to life, that they would not go back to the same behavior, they would not go back to the same ideas, they would basically be different and act differently and make different choices. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, actually, even if they were to go back, they would make the same choices, and they would do basically the same thing that they had done before. What is that supposed to tell us? So what that's supposed to tell us is that the person's behavior, the consistency that a person lives in, is basically going to determine the ending. That's generally what we would get out of even the hadith. When the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned, we yesterday mentioned the story of that man that was narrated in the story, that was narrated in Bukhari and Muslim. So he was basically fighting, and eventually, of course, committed suicide, even though he was actually the most courageous and the one to be at the forefront within the battle. But the Prophet ﷺ said he was going to be from Ahl al-Nar. And the thing is that the Prophet ﷺ giving us a commentary on that إِنَّ الرَّجُلَ لَا يَعْمَلُ بِعَمَلِ أَهْلِ الْجَنَّةِ فِيمَا يَبْدُو لِلنَّاسِ. That a person might do a certain action to what appears to people is that this person is nothing but a person of Jannah. But what is within is what's actually going to be determining the place and the consequence of that person, where they're going to be. Now, having that being said, when we look at وَلَوْ رُدُّوا لَعَادُوا لِمَا نُهُوا عَنْهُ, that's in order to let us know that the lifestyle, the choices that one stays committed to, that they would not change, because it will be basically what will determine the person's path. It will go onto the surface. وَقَالُوا إِنْ هِيَ إِلَّا حَيَاتُنَا الدُّنْيَا. And they said, this is only this life that we're living. In other words, it's just matter in motion. وَمَا نَحْنُ بِمَبْعُوثِينَ. And they had claimed that there was going to be no resurrection whatsoever. They weren't going to be resurrected. That was their claim. وَلَوْ تَرَى إِذْ وُقِفُوا عَلَى رَبِّهِمْ. وَلَوْ تَرَى إِذْ وُقِفُوا عَلَى رَبِّهِمْ. If you would only see when they would be standing right before their Lord Almighty. قَالَ أَلَيْسَ هَذَا بِالْحَقِّ. The Lord Almighty would tell them, or is it the malaika? Isn't this the truth? And they would say, قَالُوا بَلَا وَرَبِّنَا. Verily, they would say, absolutely, this is truth. Why? Because they were saying before that this was never going to be happening. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then responds, قال فذوقوا العذاب بما كنتم تكفرون نسأل الله العفو والعافية. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would respond, well, now you're going to be tasting the torments of what you had denied. So a couple words to look at right there. Number one, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَقَالُوا إِنْ هِيَ إِلَّا حَيَاتُنَا الدُّنْيَا. Okay, so what are we understanding and why are we going this? I want you to go back to this. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَلَوْ رُدُّوا لَعَادُوا لِمَا نُهُوا عَنْهُ, if they were to come back, they would do whatever they had done. Okay, now this is actually key. And what we're trying to investigate is why would why did this ayah actually tell us that if they were to come back to life, that they would actually get into the same behavior, into the same choices? So that's when you would see that semicolon coming right there. Number one is that they were liars. Were they living a life of lying? Were they living a life of discrepancies? Is that one of them? Two, وَقَالُوا إِنْ هِيَ إِلَّا حَيَاتُنَا الدُّنْيَا. The second thing that they said, they just claimed that this is just this life. In other words, they lived their life like there's no hereafter. They lived their life like there's no hereafter. That's number two. And وَمَا نَحْنُ بِمَبْعُوثِينَ. And they were basically creating. I want you to look at this one because they didn't just live their life there's no hereafter. Because وَقَالُوا إِنْ هِيَ إِلَّا حَيَاتُنَا الدُّنْيَا. That's sentence number one. وَمَا نَحْنُ بِمَبْعُوثِينَ. That's sentence number two. وَمَا نَحْنُ بِمَبْعُوثِينَ. That means, and we're not going to be resurrected. If you look at the first sentence, وَقَالُوا إِنْ هِيَ إِلَّا حَيَاتُنَا الدُّنْيَا, that's a life that they were living. Okay, were they necessarily saying it لسان الحال or لسان المقال? Could be both. لسان الحال, in other words, they're living it in their life. This is basically the lifestyle that they're living based on. And لسان المقال is that they were literally saying that. It can be both. Okay, وما نحن بمبعوثين, and making this this type of an affirmed sentence. They were really, what is the word that we could say? They were really insisting that no, there's no resurrection. It's just that. And when you insist on something, it basically becomes, certainly not only is it this confidence, but it becomes this place that it starts making the people around you doubt themselves. Okay, because the person is living in this confidence, and then the person around these people, they basically start, let's say, honoring this confidence that they're living in. So then later on down the road in their life, this confidence that they're living in, it becomes so strong that they basically start building inside their brain this aqidah of not leaving any room to accept the truth. وَلَوْ تَرَى إِذْ وُقِفُوا عَلَى رَبِّهِمْ. What is the consequence? وَلَوْ تَرَى, if you were to see them, and here's this one, وَلَوْ تَرَى. Didn't it say وَلَوْ تَرَى right there again? Here we go. إِذْ وُقِفُوا again. So why did it repeat وَلَوْ تَرَى إِذْ وُقِفُوا عَلَى النَّارِ, and here وَلَوْ تَرَى إِذْ وُقِفُوا عَلَى رَبِّهِمْ? What's the difference? The first one, وَلَوْ تَرَى إِذْ وُقِفُوا عَلَى النَّارِ, if you were to see them standing at the threshold of the fire, or is it standing on the bridge over the fire, or is it standing facing the fire? Regardless, at the end, they're standing, basically encountering their fate right now at the hellfire. Yet this one, وَلَوْ تَرَى إِذْ وُقِفُوا عَلَى رَبِّهِمْ, this is a different station. The first station was when they were recognizing that there's the fate of the hellfire. But then in this station, وَلَوْ تَرَى إِذْ وُقِفُوا عَلَى رَبِّهِمْ, when they would stand before Allah Almighty. قَالَ لَيْسَ هَذَا بِالْحَقِّ. But this is not doing a conversation just for the sake of conversation. He would tell them, isn't this the truth? And then they would say, بَلَا وَرَبِّنَا. Verily, by our Lord. What are they doing right now? They're right now having a conversation, but this conversation wasn't for the sake of conversation. This is right there as what is called tawbih. It's scolding them. Their Lord Almighty is right now telling them, isn't this the truth? Didn't I send you messengers to tell you that this was coming? And they would say, Bala wa Rabbina. What is the word Bala? Bala actually means for sure. In other words, now they're putting in a different confirmation, a different affirmation, when before they had made a different, confident affirmation. Now they're coming in to encounter their fate and recognize reality. وَرَبِّنَا. What is وَرَبِّنَا? Now they're making an oath, like, absolutely by our Lord Almighty, this is the truth. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, well, قَالَ فَذُوقُوا الْعَذَابِ. Then encounter and taste the torments of what you had denied. قَدْ خَسِرَ الَّذِينَ كَذَّبُوا بِلِقَاءِ اللَّهِ. Now, those that had denied meeting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, now they are the ones to be in loss. حتى إذا جاءتهم الساعة بغتة قالوا يا حسرتنا. Until الساعة or the hour comes all of a sudden when they would least expect it, and then they would say يا حسرتنا. What is يا حسرتنا? يا حسرتنا is basically a word that is speaking of what they would feel, how they would live that sorrow, they would live that regret. على ما فرطنا فيها. What is فرطنا? Is it to miss on something? Or is it to give up on something? Is it to not anticipate? We're going to get there. وهم يحملون أوزارهم على ظهورهم. And they would carry الوزر. What is الوزر? So they يحملون, carry. الأوزار are basically the plural of the verb وزر. وزر, is it to mean to aid, or is it to mean to commit a transgression? So if we're talking about they would be carrying, certainly that isn't to aiding, but then يحملون أوزارهم, they're carrying their sins. Okay, على ظهورهم. Are they literally carrying their sins on their back, or are they carrying it metaphorically? What does that even look like? So we're going to talk about that, inshallah. ألا ساء ما يزرون. What is ألا ساء ما يزرون? ألا ساء ما يزرون. This is the commentary that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically putting in commenting about whatever they're carrying on their backs. And then it takes us to one, just as they had said, وَمَا وَقَالُوا إِنْ هِيَ إِلَّا حَيَاتُنَا الدُّنْيَا. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes us to say, okay, well, let me explain al-hayat ad-dunya for you. Now let me respond. Since you had said, that is basically the disbelievers, that this life is nothing but, it's this life, matter in motion. So let us just live it. Stop being too judgmental. Stop being over our backs. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would say, okay, let me break it down for you and let you know that al-hayatu dunya, this life that you're living, it's nothing but la'ib and nothing but lahu. It's, most of you, in fact, are going to be spending it in la'ib, playing, and entertainment. But if this la'ib and lahu is basically 90% of the time, and وَلَدَّارُ الْآخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ لِلَّذِينَ يَتَّقُونَ, and the hereafter is better for who? It would be better for those that would be in taqwa, in religious integrity. أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ. Now it's taking us to letting them know, I thought you were so smart to actually say that life is so mad, is nothing but matter in motion. Seems like it was a scientific word, but after all, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, وَأَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ. Didn't you actually see that there were patterns telling you that this sophisticated life, this complex creation, whether it's the physics of it or the biology or whatever that you see around you, that it's far more complex than being of nothing but created for absurdity and no purpose. So therefore, did you really think that you were smart to think that it was nothing but matter in motion? Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ? Did you really think that that was smart to think? Did you really think that that was smart to think, to just think of life as nothing but matter in motion? Then certainly you would attempt and put in all the efforts to do da'wah. And the Prophet ﷺ was certainly doing the same. So the ayah continues to comfort the Prophet ﷺ and said, قَدْ نَعْلَمُ إِنَّهُ لَيَحْزُنُكَ الَّذِي يَقُولُونَ. We know that you are saddened by what they would say. فَإِنَّهُمْ لَا يُكَذِّبُونَكَ. For they're not just denying you. وَلَكِنَّ الظَّالِمِينَ بِآيَاتِ اللَّهِ يَجْحَدُونَ. It's not that it's saying they're not denying you alone. No, it's the ayah is basically saying that it's like, don't take it personal. Don't take it personal. وَلَكِنَّ الظَّالِمِينَ بِآيَاتِ اللَّهِ يَجْحَدُونَ. Because at the end, those that were oppressing themselves, those that were transgressing the limit, they're denying the words of the Lord Almighty. So let's see what happened. How did they get there? So this is number 3. They said, وَمَا نَحْنُ بِمَبْعُوثِينَ. Now this ayah continues to explain, but from a different angle, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically telling us, here's number 4, that they had lived their life as there was no akhirah. The implication of their words that ما هي إلا حياتنا الدنيا وما نحن بمبعوثين. Here's the implication. They lived it as nothing but لعب and له, nothing but play and entertainment. That was the implication. So then the other side would be, for a believer, they would live for one goal, which is الدار الآخرة. They would recognize a mu'min, a muttaqi, they would recognize they're being smart. They're recognizing that there's a pattern. So what would they do? Well, they would embrace Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's path, and they would keep holding on to the taqwa, to the religious integrity, because they know that that is better than engaging in meaningless play and entertainment. So then the other part, so that was number 4. Okay, let's go for number 5. وَلَكِنَّ الظَّالِمِينَ بِآيَاتِ اللَّهِ يَجْحَدُونَ. Now, in the word of ظالمين, we would know they were not only living in la'ib and lahu, but certainly that they were transgressing many limits. It wasn't just one type of dhulm, but it was transgressing many limits. Why? Because if you don't have the compass to help you identify right and wrong, then certainly you're going to transgress many, many, many limits. And without you realizing, those many limits that you'll be transgressing are basically going to lead you to بِآيَاتِ اللَّهِ يَجْحَدُونَ. Then they would continue to not recognize the truth in the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then they would be يَجْحَدُونَ. What is الجحود? الجحود is to deny. Okay, al-juhud is to deny, but al-juhud goes farther than just living in denial. Al-juhud also means that the person is living in pride, is living in arrogance, that pride and that arrogance to reject the truth. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Prophet ﷺ, وَلَقَدْ كُذِّبَتْ رُسُلٌ مِّن قَبْلِكَ. I want you to recognize, because he said, فَإِنَّهُمْ لَا يُكَذِّبُونَكَ. Then it goes to say, well, they weren't just denying you, in other words. Then it continues to say, okay, وَلَقَدْ كُذِّبَتْ رُسُلٌ مِّن قَبْلِكَ. They had denied many prophets before you. Now it's taking the mu'mineen. Now, for al-mu'mineen, they're aiming at al-akhirah. Okay, now it's directed at the Prophet ﷺ, but the story is not only directed to the Prophet ﷺ, it's also directed for the mu'mineen that would continue with the legacy. So it said, وَلَقَدْ كُذِّبَتْ رُسُلٌ مِّن قَبْلِكَ. I want you to see that many prophets before you were denied, were rejected. فَصَبَرُوا عَلَى مَا كُذِّبُوا. Then they embraced as-sabr. They embraced patience. Wait a minute. How is patience coming in within this context? There's no way that you can practice taqwa if you don't practice a couple things. Number one, you recognize truth. Two, we talked about this before, if you remember, everybody. We talked about this before. You recognize truth, then you live the patience, sabr, and then there's also that iffa, that basically satisfaction. In other words, you're going to be tested and they're going to offer you. If they're seeing that you're basically standing solid, strong, and not willing to give up, they'll basically give you offers. You'll be given offers. If you are to do what we tell you, we'll basically give you a good endorsement on your CV, or probably give you a good endorsement or a promotion, basically, in your job, etc. And then we live in this basically testing us in our iman. So then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically tells us to live al-iffa. I know it's misspelled right there, but that's okay. And the last one is courage. There's no way that you could live the courage if you don't recognize how to take away the fear. Courage, it also doesn't mean that you're completely eliminating fear. It just means you're weighing the fears. There's this fear of what they would be facing you with, what they would be trying to oppose you with, what they would be trying to threaten you in order to take away your faith, in order to basically test how committed you are, etc. So some would basically endure and practice good patience. What is patience? Patience, it doesn't mean that the pain is not there. The pain is there, but to you, the pain is not what you would be focusing on. Why? Because you're looking at وَلَدَارُ الْآخِرَةِ خَيْرٌ. You're looking at your goal is Darul Akhirah, is the hereafter. That's your goal. That's what would then feed your courage. That's what would then give you that endurance, and no fear basically stands in your on your path. Because why? Because you are a person of taqwa. What is it, taqwa? Taqwa means to fear as well. So if the taqwa means to fear, how is it that they're fearing? Yes, they're fearing Allah, and therefore, it's kind of like a lens. You look at the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you look at the consequence. If you were to transgress the limits that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said, then that fear that they are coming at your face with, it becomes something that is so small. You don't fear it anymore. You build the courage. You strengthen and you build the courage within you. And then وَأُوذُوا حَتَّى أَتَاهُمْ نَصْرُنَا. What were they enduring? وَأُوذُوا حَتَّى أَتَاهُمْ نَصْرُنَا. They were actually put in lots of pain. Udhu. What is udhu? Udhu means that they were harmed. They were harmed. They were probably struggling to even grow with their deen. 2, their life was probably put at risk. Their children's lives were put at risk. And 3, mental health. They're living in anxiety and afraid that what's going to happen next. 4, their family, their chastity, all that area of probably maybe losing the job, maybe losing security, maybe losing all of that. That was put at risk. That's udhu. It didn't tell us in all the details, but in other ayat, it did tell us that, well, did you actually think you will get to Jannah if you did not actually face the hardship in your wealth and your health and in your life and all of that? There's no way. حَتَّى أَتَاهُمْ نَصْرُنَا. But they were insisting to live the patience, to live the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, حَتَّى أَتَاهُمْ نَصْرُنَا, until they basically had received, until victory had come to them. وَلَا مُبَدِّلَ لِكَلِمَاتِ اللَّهِ. And there's no change in the words of the Lord Almighty. What words? There's no change in the words of the Lord Almighty, meaning what? That there's going to be a resurrection, that there's a word of truth, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent al-wahi. There's no change. In other words, don't think that there's going to be, if one person denies the truth, it doesn't mean that that was going to be capable of creating new facts on ground. وَلَقَدْ جَاءَكَ مِن نَبَإِ الْمُرْسَلِينَ. And you had received from the stories of the different prophets and the messengers. Why? That's in order for us to recognize that that's how the story started. The story started in the story of Risala, the story of the message, the story of the legacy of all the prophets, the story of Tawheed. The story really started out in one way, but it continues in the same pattern. One, certain people wanting to live in dunya and deny al-akhirah, and others basically facing that opposition from the disbelievers, but they would insist to live it taqwa. They would insist to live the words of Allah Almighty. They would endure the patience, whatever it takes. They would not surrender to or give in to basically the offers that are given to them, and they would not surrender to the different fears that are put in their face. وَإِن كَانَ كَبُرَ عَلَيْكَ إِعْرَاضُهُم فَإِنِ اسْتَطَعْتَ أَن تَبْتَغِيَ نَفَقًا فِي الْأَرْضِ أَوْ سُلَّمًا فِي السَّمَاءِ فَيَأْتِيهِم بِآيَةٍ ولو شاء الله لجمعهم على الهدى فلا تكونن من الجاهلين. And I want you to look at a couple of things here. Certainly, if you were to look at these ayat, let's erase some things for us to kind of see other corners within these ayat. Let's see. So the first one is saying قد نعلم إنه لا يحزنك الذي يقولون. Let's see. Number 2, كبر عليك إعراضهم. So the Prophet ﷺ was basically definitely living this sadness. It was anxiety. It was definitely taking a toll on him. And that's why the ayah continues to say, كبر عليك إعراضهم. What's the difference between that كبر عليك and الحزن? الحزن is an inner feeling of sorrow, and you're definitely having that pity to basically see how they're opposing all of this, how they're leaving the truth. You're putting in all the effort to let them see it, to let them recognize it, because it's worth Jannah. And then in the second one, kabura alayk. What is kabura? Means to make it something big. But what was made big? إعراضهم. إعراضهم, their rejection, was becoming so big. In other words, so heavy. We can't say in English, we can't say so big in terms of their rejection, because in English they would say so heavy. They would look at it from the weight. But in Lugha Arabiya, we would say kabura alayka, to mean that it's not a hyperbole. It's saying, well, it's something that you would see it as magnificent in weight and in size. You would recognize the weight of it / the implication of it, and you would recognize the magnitude of what opposition that they are doing and what they're losing. So this is kabura alayk. Now, the implication on the Prophet ﷺ was definitely saying, well, you were really saddened by it, but I want you to recognize that at the end, وَمَا عَلَى الرَّسُولِ إِلَّا الْبَلَاغِ. You've got a duty, which is to deliver the message. At one point, you're just going to وَهْجُرْهُمْ هَجْرًا جَمِيلًا. You're just going to take stance and basically just pull back. Because if you had delivered the message, then at one point, I don't want it to take a toll over you. That is telling the Prophet ﷺ, don't let that basically get into bringing harm onto you and basically affecting you, whether we're speaking about affecting your heart, affecting you mentally, or affecting you physically. I don't want it to be something in there, because you want to recognize, even though the Prophet ﷺ was putting in the effort, the logical efforts, and all the different efforts to deliver the message, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, even if you had actually somehow opened up a tunnel in the middle of the earth, or in the different layers of earth, or even if you had put in and put up basically a sullaman fi sama, a ladder to reach to the heavens, and you brought them the ayat and you brought them the verses right before their eyes, did it say what would happen? No, it didn't say what would happen, but it let you know before that لَعَادُوا لِمَا نُهُوا عَنْهُ. They would basically go back to that behavior. So at the end, this is inevitable for someone that's living a life of rejection, living a life of life that there's no purpose to it, and therefore the only purpose is اللعب واللهو. Then in that situation, you could say, فإن استطعت أن تبتغي نفقا في الأرض أو سلما في السماء فتأتيهم بآية, they would still live the same rejection. وَلَوْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ لَجَمَعَهُمْ عَلَى الْهُدَى. If the Lord Almighty would have wanted to make everyone be a believer, He would have been capable of doing that by doing what? By probably taking away their free will and making them have no will but to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَلَا تَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْجَاهِلِينَ. Don't be amongst those that are jahilin. So wait a minute, would I necessarily be a jahil person if I basically were feeling the momentum and the implication and the sadness of what they were doing? Would I be amongst the jahilin if I had these sentiments right there? Or what does it really mean? Why is it saying فَلَا تَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْجَاهِلِينَ? We're going to answer those questions once we get to Tafseer al-Qurtubi, and that's what we want to do. But before we answer that question, let's see the other questions that we'll be answering, inshallah. Number one, why would it say فَلَا تَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْجَاهِلِينَ, which is the same word that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had told Prophet Nuh alayhi salam, إِنِّي أَعِذُكَ أَن تَكُونَ مِنَ الْجَاهِلِينَ. And then I think Prophet Musa alayhi salam was also told something similar, that that action basically would be the action of al-jahili. So what is al-jahilin anyways? And is it that if I were to somehow carry all those sentiments of sorrow because people are rejecting the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is that basically making me a jahil person? Or what is it? Let's see the other questions. The other questions, وَلَوْ تَرَى إِذْ وُقِفُوا عَلَى رَبِّهِمْ. So were they actually standing? Is there another qira'ah, since the previous one actually said waqafu is one qira'ah and wuqifu is another qira'ah? Are there any other qira'at to that? And when we look at قَدْ خَسِرَ الَّذِينَ كَذَّبُوا بِلِقَاءِ اللَّهِ, so if قَدْ خَسِرَ الَّذِينَ كَذَّبُوا بِلِقَاءِ اللَّهِ, I thought the only ones that were supposed to be seen Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala were the believers. So how come it says بِلِقَاءِ اللَّهِ? So then they get to see Allah. I thought there was going to be no conversation, because they're disbelievers and therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would turn away from them. So how come this ayah is saying بِلِقَاءِ اللَّهِ? So how do we understand that? Okay. And those questions, inshallah, let's try answering them. And let's go back to Tafseer al-Qurtubi, because Tafseer al-Qurtubi has great answers for some of those questions. Let's say, قَدْ خَسِرَ الَّذِينَ كَذَّبُوا بِلِقَاءِ اللَّهِ. Here's the first question. So what is بِلِقَاءِ اللَّهِ? Is this talking? First of all, when you look at the word بِلِقَاء, what is اللقاء? So the ones that had denied meeting Allah, they would be the ones to be in loss. The word khasira. Is it loss? So let me explain one thing. The word khasira would usually be a word in the context of transactions. Like you get into some business, and then it's either a business or we're speaking about a trade-off, like a battle. You get into a battle, it's either victory or loss. Okay. And al-khusran is usually in transactions. You get into a business doesn't work out, you basically lose not only, I guess, the effort in making the business, but you might even lose the money that you had invested. That's basically loss. Okay. So how is that even loss when it comes to akhirah? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you the energy, you had basically the different potentials, you had this life, and all of those things you had invested basically you were supposed to invest it to get a big trade-off, a big basically a big reward, in other words, a big achievement, which is Jannah. And what were you supposed to invest? You were supposed to invest using, whether it's your time, that is your life, or whether it is the different things that you have in this life, potentials, intelligence, maybe money, maybe energy, effort, time, etc. That's what you were supposed to invest in. That was your net. That was basically all that money let's say that you needed to put in order to get to Jannah. How much of your time did you invest in order to get to Jannah? How much of your wealth? How much of your effort? How much of probably your dhikr, whatever, what did you do with it? And that was supposed to be that price in order to get you into the voucher to go to the Jannah. Okay. قد خسر, when you look at the word خسر, like I said, it's basically tell us that there was something that you were granted. You had basically something that was going to be a main key to giving you a voucher to get something big. But that was خسروا. الذين كذبوا. The word كذبوا is different than كذبوا, because كذبوا, this shadda right there, is telling us that there was consistency in it. Whenever you would have a shadda, it would either mean something gradual, or it would mean something consistent, or it would mean something that is exaggerated, or something that is big. Okay, so in this situation, كذبوا بلقاء الله, they were denying it on and on and on. In other words, they were consistent in denying لقاء الله. But here's the question. If we're saying that بلقاء الله, is this talking about just a resurrection? Is it that they denied that they would be resurrected, and therefore بلقاء الله is not literally, but this is actually talking about that they denied that there was anything that they will encounter before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that they would be held accountable standing before Allah Almighty? Or did they really stand before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Let's see. Now, there's that hadith. Let's see this hadith, because this hadith is going to answer the question. I thought they weren't going to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I thought they don't get to speak to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let's look at this hadith. من حلف على يمين كاذبة ليقتطع بها مال امرئ مسلم لقي الله وهو عليه غضبان. What is this saying? Whoever makes an oath where they're lying about it in order to use that as a bridge or as a way to basically deduct from the wealth of another Muslim in order to, in other words, to basically steal from someone else, that is, or probably either using an oath. They're like, hey, I'll just make that yameen and get away with probably making a narrative and letting the others believe that this money belongs to me. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, لَقِيَ اللَّهَ. Look at the word لَقِيَ. They would meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala while Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is عليه غضبان. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would be basically angry at them. What does that mean? Well, that means they're not going to be getting the mercy. But here's the key word, لَقِيَ اللَّهِ. Is لَقِيَ Allah to really face Allah Almighty? Or is this to mean لَقِيَ جَزَاءَهُ, that they would basically encounter and face the consequence of what they had committed? Why? Because if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is angry at a person, then they would not be seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore they would not be getting the wording directly with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would dismiss them. Okay, so therefore, when we speak about liqa'illah, we're speaking about the idea of being held accountable, of being basically before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on Judgment Day. But certainly, just because it says biliqa'illah, it doesn't mean that they get to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It doesn't mean that they get to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is talking about the idea of meeting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and basically standing before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Same thing, لَقِيَ اللَّهُ وَهُوَ عَلَيْهِ غَضْبَانٌ, that they would encounter, they would basically face Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically angry at them. Okay, and certainly, حَتَّى إِذَا جَاءَتْهُمُ السَّاعَةُ بَغْتَةً, and when you see the other part of the ayah, let's see. When they said, وَمَا نَحْنُ بِمَبْعُوثِينَ, and of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, حَتَّى إِذَا جَاءَتْهُمُ السَّاعَةُ بَغْتَةً. So what was it that they had denied? Okay, so where was it? Okay. حتى إذا جاءتهم الساعة بغتة, right here. Let me erase all of this so you could see. Okay, here we go. We're going to erase all of this. All right. There we go. Okay, now we're at this A. حتى إذا جاءتهم الساعة بغتة. Okay, and when, let's see, ساعة. What is it, ساعة? Is it ساعة? Is it the clock, or is it the watch, or what is it? Okay, so حتى إذا جاءتهم الساعة بغتة, the word is ساعة was actually called ساعة because of the velocity that basically that happens on Judgment Day. Wait a minute, how is it ساعة? I mean, I thought it was 50 to 50,000 years to 100,000 years. How is that speed? How is that fast? That's not fast. That's really slow if we're talking about 50 to 100,000 years. Okay. Now, 50 to 100,000 years based on your timing. Okay. And when you say that it was called a sa'a, so whether that your life is short to be called sa'a, that sa'a, is it this life is sa'a, or is it the hereafter is sa'a? No, sa'a is talking about the hereafter, يوم القيامة, that it's like an hour. Wait a minute, I thought we were going to be in Jannah eternally. How is it an hour? No, we're speaking about the time of resurrection. We're speaking about this life basically ending. So the ending of life is coming fast, and that's why it's called Sa'ah. Okay, the ending of life is coming fast, and that's why it's called Sa'ah. In other words, it's short. Okay, so when you say Sa'ah, you're speaking about, one, that it's short, two, that that this life ends fast, and that's why it's called momentarily. So if you were to give probably the word Sa'ah, okay, another interpretation in English, I would say momentarily. If they were to get as-sa'a baghtatan, that the end of momentarily life, that would be sa'a. That would be one interpretation. The end of the momentary life, which is when they would get that sudden moment that basically would come at their faces, basically announcing the end of time. The end of time. Here's another interpretation for sa'a, time. The end of time. So the first one was looking at it that it was momentarily, just a very short temporary period. The second one is looking at it from the angle that it is the end of time, looking at it from time. Because if you say ja'atum means it was coming to them. What was coming to them? The end of time, basically being announced. Baghtatan. So is this talking about ja'atum as-sa'a? Is this talking about Judgment Day? Or is this talking about that the person's own individual end of time? Basically, death coming to them. Okay, so in this context, this is actually talking about the end of time, meaning Yawm al-Qiyamah. But in other ayat, certainly, it can refer to meaning death. Okay, baghtatan. Why baghtatan? Baghtatan because not the malaika know when Yawm al-Qiyamah is going to happen, and no one knows when Yawm al-Qiyamah is going to happen, so it becomes a sudden thing that they would encounter and that they would see. So when you see baghtatan, that actually means suddenly. What is a sudden thing? A sudden thing is when you don't expect it. When you don't expect it, it basically comes in as something that scares you because you did not prepare for it. But if you had prepared for it and it came to you, you were training all along. That's what it means to prepare for it. It's a train all along throughout the time to meet basically this time. Okay? قالوا يا حسرتنا. They would say, woe unto us. Wait a minute. So what is ya hasratana? Ya hasratana actually means they're calling al-hasra. No, they're not calling al-hasra. So what are they calling? Because the word ya, let's see. Okay. Ya means oh. In other words, they're calling on something. Al-hasra is to feel remorse. So ya hasratana is like saying what kind of a remorse, or basically feeling the remorse and announcing the remorse that they had lost that opportunity in this dunya to make something out of it. Okay, and certainly this isn't necessarily a call to basically call out their remorse, but this is to express their remorse. Okay, that's why he said وَلَيْسَ نِدَاءٌ, and he was saying right here, where was it? Here we go. وَلَيْسَتْ بِمُنَادَى فِي الْحَقِيقَةِ. In other words, it's not literally as calling out, but this is to express. It's basically to show an expression of severe remorse. Whoa, what just happened? And basically, it's looking at it that we had lost all the opportunity to make something of what we were granted. And now they're basically living this remorse. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is exposing their remorse in order to let us know that this remorse is not something that we should be avoiding, and therefore we should be taking the potentials that we were granted seriously in order to make sure that we don't end up living this. Let's see, what is the biggest remorse though? It still didn't explain. Okay, let's see. قد خسر الذين كذبوا بلقاء الله قالوا يا حسرتنا على ما فرطنا فيها. What was the main remorse about? على ما فرطنا فيها. They were sad about ما فرطوا. What is it? تفريط. So فرط, in other words, it's basically anticipating that this was going to happen. And by anticipating that this was going to happen, you would invest in making sure that you are well prepared for it. So that's الفرطة. التفريط, one, means to lose all the different things that you had. So you had something and then you lose it, that's تفريط. And when we say لا إفراط ولا تفريط, that there's, it's between the two extremes, okay? But here, we're speaking about فرط to mean that they had something. Think of a knitted quilt. A knitted quilt, and then you would take out one piece of it, and then it goes everything that you had basically done with that knitting, it just basically ends up right there with just one line, and it ended ending all the energy that you put in and that you had invested. That's a tafrit as well. Okay, that's one tafrit. That you had put in, invested all this energy to make this quilt, a knitted quilt, but then with one thing, boom, everything's all gone. As if it might have taken you days to knit that quilt, but it took just a minute or two to end all the effort that was invested. A minute or two. That's why it becomes a sa'a. What does it do? It destructs all the effort that you had invested in the wrong thing. So recognize, not because you're putting in an effort, it doesn't necessarily bring the best outcome. So what is worth your effort? What is worth the effort is basically to invest for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's why they would say, عَلَى مَا فَرَّطْنَا فِيهَا, meaning that they had lost the opportunity to invest in this life, which is a taqdimat laha. Okay? To invest in this life. And in Lugha Arabiya, of course, when we say فرط فلان, meaning that they had anticipated, they had raced to basically get into, whether it's the privilege of water, whether it's the privilege of wealth or business or whatever it is, at the end, that it's anticipating something to come and putting in the effort to live up to that anticipation that you knew was getting there. So how do we live that? We would live that in this dunya, that our focus is on the akhirah. Wait a minute, how did you get there? Remember, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was talking about the disbelievers, what was their belief? Their belief was, it's just this life. There's nothing to look after. There's nothing to somehow anticipate was going to change. So because they thought that this is just this life, there's nothing after it, that's why then they would counter and say, عَلَى مَا فَرَّطْنَا فِيهَا, because they didn't use those key opportunities in order to get to what was going to get them to the real victory. Okay, see, the Prophet ﷺ, I thought the Prophet ﷺ said, أَنَا فَرَطُكُمْ عَلَى الْحَوْضِ. أَنَا فَرَطُكُمْ. Isn't that the same word as فَرَّطْنَا? Certainly it is. So what is فَرَطُكُمْ anyways? فَرَطُكُمْ عَلَى الْحَوْض, meaning I would be anticipating. In other words, I would be before all of you. On what? على الحوض. What is الحوض? الحوض is basically the lake that basically continues, or at least the spring of al-Kawthar would basically be coming out from a place in Jannah. Then the water starts flowing outside of Jannah onto the field of Yawm al-Qiyamah, and that's that area that it kind of creates like a lake right there. You drink from that, you would never get thirsty again. That's basically al-Kawthar. Remember, إِنَّا أَعْطَيْنَاكَ الْكَوْثَرَ, that's al-Kawthar right there. Okay, so when he said أَنَا فَرَطُكُمْ عَلَى الْحَوْض, meaning I would be basically going to that lake area before you. Okay, so I would be the one to go there before you. And there's another hadith that the Prophet ﷺ basically instructed us to make this dua whenever somebody gets a baby. Allahumma ja'alhu faratan li abaway. What? Allahumma ja'alhu faratan li abaway. We're making the dua against his parents in order for them to lose him? No, not to lose him, but that this child would, right now you had the baby. When you had the baby, okay, so far you're just investing in the baby. You're buying diapers, probably, you're spending so much on this child. The child is basically getting free rent, free food, free diapers, free maintenance, everything for free. And you're the one that's spending on this baby or on this child. So Allah, the Prophet ﷺ told us to make the dua, Allahumma ja'alhu faratan li abaway, meaning what? You make the dua, Ya Allah, let this child, not only right now that these parents are investing in this child, but this child would be the one to come forward in other words, in the investment for his parents. So the investment would be more faster than they could anticipate. That's a cute one, right? Faster than they could anticipate. So this child would probably be maybe a hafid at 10 and maybe be the smart one, be an easy one to raise and be a pious child, etc. And then therefore, when even those parents would grow old, they would already see that this child that they had raised is already a good one, is already right there also even the one to even carry and take their parents to Jannah. So faratan li abaway, whether in this dunya or in the hereafter, that they would be the ones to come at the forefront, even in Jannah and even in akhirah and even in piety. And that's why we would make the dua, Ya Allah, make us and make our children, basically, us and our children, لِلْمُتَّقِينَ إِمَامًا. We would make the dua, Ya Allah, make them leaders for the pious ones. So when we say فَرَّطْنَا, it can also mean that they had basically not used that opportunity, and therefore they're recognizing their inability, their loss of hope for what they did not anticipate. So they did not use it for worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or even leaving and making that trade-off. What is that trade-off? Trade-off that I'm leaving basically whatever is in leaving maybe the wealth, maybe the dunya, all of that for the sake of akhirah. Okay, so al-Badri had said something interesting. He said, when you look at فيها, يا حسرتنا على ما فرطنا فيها, he said, what this would actually refer to, that pronoun right there, فرطنا فيها, al-Qurtubi said, well, what this pronoun is referring to, it basically goes back to that, يا حسرتنا. Okay, what is it? He said it goes back to that pronoun that they had basically not invested in this akhirah, and therefore they recognized that they had lost the trade-off. They had lost because they were living in their kufr, that they had lost an opportunity to live in al-iman. So therefore they lost that deal. What is the deal? فَمَا رَبِحَتْ تِجَارَتُهُمْ. Then their deal is basically in complete loss. What was the deal? The deal was use the potentials that you basically have in this dunya in order to win al-akhirah. Simple. What energy do you have? Is it wealth? Is it intelligence? Is it perhaps activism, your energy, whatever it is? Use it or lose it. You're either going to use it for akhirah or you're going to lose your akhirah. Okay, so that's basically simple. Use it or lose it. You're either using your potentials for al-akhirah or they're right there. They had lost their potentials and now they lost that investment and lost the trade and lost the opportunity. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in another surah, فَمَا رَبِحَتْ تِجَارَتُهُم. So what did they do? They basically had lost any investment to get into Jannah, and therefore the Prophet ﷺ, the hadith, he said, يَرَى أَهْلُ النَّارِ مَنَازِلَهُم فِي الْجَنَّةِ فَيَقُولُونَ يَا حَسْرَتَنَا. The people of hellfire would basically get the opportunity to see their homes that were in Jannah. Wait, they had homes in Jannah? I thought they didn't. Yep, they had homes in Jannah that was already prepared for them. So they would be given the opportunity to see it. It's like, that was supposed to be under your name, but you didn't invest to get it. It was already set for you. Ya Allah. That was the hasra. That was the remorse. It's like, it's already in my name, but I didn't get it. Ya Rabbi, Ya Allah, Ya Allah. نسأل الله العفو والعافية. وهم يحملون أوزارهم على ظهورهم. They would carry الوزر, الذنوب, would carry their sins. So what's the plural of what? The singular is wizr, and awzar is basically the plural. This is the singular, this is the plural. على ظهورهم. And they would carry them on their backs. Is this necessarily that they were literally carrying like the sins on their backs? He said this is a metaphor. This is majaz. This is a metaphor. This is figurative. But this is basically to give an idea that it would be similar to a person carrying all the different sins or all the different implications of what they had committed as if they were carrying it on their backs. And they would be as if it's a mountain right there, and they would be carrying that the implication of it. They would be carrying it not literally, but carrying basically the accountability of it, and they recognize it. Okay, and certainly when we say in Lugha Arabiya, احمل وزرك, carry your basically the weight, carrying the weight, and we're speaking about carrying the weight. In other words, on Judgment Day, what are we looking at when we say يحملون أوزارهم? That the person himself, your weight is not your physical weight, but it's actually the deeds that you had invested. So a person's weight, a person's value is going to be based on the good deeds that they had invested. It's not the appearance. It's not what a person had somehow invested in their body, but it's invested in their akhirah. So what happens? There are certain points and different stations on Judgment Day. Some stations, they would basically recognize weight. The weight of good deeds, the weight of bad deeds. And in some stations, it would turn into velocity, speed. Just like over the Sirat. What happens? Over Sirat, it's speed. So right there, when we look at أَلَا سَاءَ مَا يَزِرُونَ, أَلَا سَاءَ مَا يَزِرُونَ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is then presenting it. That's the worst thing that they would carry. All the weight of their evil deeds. ألا ساء ما يزرون. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ya Rabbi, نسأل الله العفو والعافية, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us amongst those that are living وَلَدَارُ الْآخِرَةِ خَيْرٌ لِلَّذِينَ يَتَّقُونَ. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us from those that would live dar al-akhirah as being better for us and for make us amongst those that would live at-taqwa. Allahumma ameen. So we're going to be ending right here, inshallah, and tomorrow we're actually going to be getting the fiqh. Okay? So inshallah, we'll continue, at least we know where we're at, right? And if there are any questions while I'm erasing and doing all of that, go ahead and unmute yourselves if you would like. Because the day that we would do the tafseer again, we'll continue this piece of it. وَمَا الْحَيَاةُ الدُّنْيَا إِلَّا لَعِبٌ وَلَهْوٌ. Because we just left off at this one. Okay? And we'll go to Tafsir al-Qurtubi and see what he says in regards to those ayat. Okay, so anybody has any questions? Please invite your friends. Oh, okay, sir.